Hello, Cupcake. We're going to do things a little differently today. Instead of the usual role play, I'm going to tell you something of a bedtime story. I'm going to tell you all about the vampire who came to Dreamy's house one night when his car broke down, starved and near death because he wouldn't feed on an unwilling human. So sit back, relax, and I'll tell you a little backstory about this guy. The vampire used to be human, as did all vampires. But his transformation story was a little different than most. He was kidnapped by an ancient vampire, one of the ones who'd been around almost as long as humanity could tell stories about terrors in the dark. She saw him and thought he'd be a fun pet project, so she snatched him off the street. By screaming help in an alley, he went to save her and got drugged immediately. And she tortured him psychologically while using him as a blood bag for a whole year. She almost drained him multiple times. She alternated between being terrifying and angry and abusing him, and caring and loving and promising to protect him from her other side. She didn't have two personalities. She just wanted to make him love her, hate her, and fear her in equal measure. She kept thinking that she'd finally broken him and almost got bored and finally killed him multiple times. But every time he found some new reserve of will and kept fighting back, kept refusing to love her or go insane, kept trying to escape. After a year of this, she decided he was too fun a toy to kill. So she turned him into a vampire to keep him around forever. The torture now took on a new aspect, with her starving him enough to put him into a blood frenzy, and then letting him have humans to drain. Being tortured by her hadn't managed to kill his spirit, but not being able to stop himself from killing humans, that seemed to fairly quickly. After only the third human, while, of course, the usual regimen of abuse and emotional whiplash went on in the background, it finally seemed like he was broken. He stopped fighting back. He accepted her love, did whatever she ordered. He even killed a human without breaking down crying. The ancient vampire, thinking he was finally dead inside, got bored and went to another continent on business. While she was gone, she didn't leave him chained up like usual. She didn't even think he'd be a problem. She thought his love for her and fear of her would overwhelm his hatred. She wasn't counting on his last vestige of mule-headed, stubborn defiance. He left her mansion and went to the cathedral it amused her to be so near to. Vampires can't enter churches because part of being a vampire involves killing innocents, and God's not a fan of that. Or at least, vampires can't enter churches without feeling like acid's been poured directly into their guts. The vampire wasn't willing to let that stop him, though. The bowl of holy water, which naturally was on the opposite side of the building from where he entered, took what felt like hours to reach. When he finally got there, he filled up an empty wine bottle, being so careful not to let a drop touch his skin. He almost collapsed from the pain while doing so, but the thought of his mistress tormenting more innocents kept him on his feet. When the ancient vampire returned to the mansion, she ordered him to pour them both a glass of wine, as he knew she would. He had to act like a mindless, broken slave, If she even suspected something was wrong, she would just order him to drink it first, and that would be the end of everything. Even if she didn't suspect anything, she might have them drink at the same time, and then he'd die with her. He might have been okay with that. Might have welcomed it, even. But he knew he couldn't bear to die while she still lived. He thought he'd given himself away multiple times, but she barely paid any attention to him, thinking him just another husk. She took a long draught from her goblet. Solid gold, naturally. A relic from an empire humanity doesn't even remember the name of. And she didn't feel the holy water until it hit her stomach. Her insides started burning then, and she knew she'd been betrayed. She tried to kill him as a last act of spite and vengeance, and almost managed it, for older vampires are far stronger, faster, and harder to kill than the young. She would have, in fact, managed to rip his head off of his shoulders before crumbling to dust herself, if he'd run like she predicted he would. But instead, he ran towards her. He realized at the last instant that he couldn't actually be certain if holy water would kill a vampire. After all, she told him that. So, he charged towards her, vowing to himself to tear her apart or die trying. She was thrown off balance by what she viewed as an unthinkable turn of events. A prey animal charging her? Preposterous. Before she could recover and kill him, though, she lost the use of her central nervous system. She crumbled to dust in his arms. After that, he simply lay on the floor and wept. Tears of joy for his newfound freedom, tears of sorrow for the woman part of him couldn't help but love, and tears of hopelessness, because he now had no idea what to do. What she'd never quite done in life was finally accomplished by her death. He broke. He lay on the floor for 2 weeks, unable to move, to think. If he'd still been human, he probably wouldn't have been able to breathe. After 2 weeks, though, his hunger grew too great to ignore. He mindlessly got up, not thinking, just going through the motions like an automaton. He went down to her prey pens without even realizing what he was doing, and took out a human. She saw the absolute nothingness in his eyes and screamed. He had been just about to bite down and drink, most likely enough to kill her. But the scream made him remember something. He paused in his motions just long enough for some part of him that was still himself to come to the surface. Disgust in his eyes, he threw her away from him, then opened the doors to all the pens. One of them was jammed. He ripped it off its hinges. He told all of the prisoners to leave, to run to the church for sanctuary. Some did. Others stayed in the pens, fearing the wrath of their captors should they leave. He had to terrify them into saving their own lives. He then sat in the mansion, surrounded by opulence, and yet left with nothing. He contemplated killing himself. The goblet of holy water was still there. After a while of thinking about it, he actually picked it up and went to take a drink. But then he saw his reflection in the liquid. Vampires don't have reflections. At all. Not in mirrors, not in windows, not in water. If he could see himself in the holy water, it had to mean something. It had to mean that there was something human left in him. That he wasn't gone. That his life was still worth fighting for. He threw the goblet aside and took a deep breath. He would live for something then. Not just for himself. He wasn't anything anymore. He swore then that he would never allow another human to come to harm, not while there was anything he could do about it. It's been a couple of years since all of that. He's managed to appropriate all of his old mistress's money and property, and has repurposed most of it to help fund organizations that try to protect humanity from the depredations of the supernatural. He's blocked off most of the traumatic memories from his time as a blood bag and as a murderer. But he still knows too much of what happened. He is a sad boy. But he's trying to move past all of that. Feeding as little as possible and never taking from humans was one of the ways he tried to prove to himself that he was a good person. It was failing. Until a kind stranger came along and shattered that. He now realizes that he can feed off of humans without being evil. But he isn't sure enough of himself yet to do anything with that knowledge. He currently plans to go back to his starvation diet. But he does want to interact with the stranger more. She made him feel more human. Also, simple kindness isn't something he's received in a long time. Since even before he got kidnapped. He wants to get to know better the kind of person who'd see a vampire starving to death and risk her own life to help. And that brings us up to the place where the story overlaps with the roleplay I've already released. I'll link to it in the description if you haven't already heard it. Our vampire and the stranger seem to be at the beginning of a beautiful relationship. Will there be more to the story? I'm not sure. But I do know the scriptwriter has so many delicious scripts with negos and gendres and aliens and all kinds of things you know I cannot resist. So we'll at least be hearing more from that beautifully creative mind that goes by the name of Stormcoming6 on YouTube and Stormcoming7 on Reddit. On both social media profiles, you can find more of their scripts and the people who have voiced them. I highly recommend giving them a look-see. But that is it for now, Cupcakes. I hope you all know how I appreciate you. Thank you all so much for being such flashes of kindness in a sometimes dark internet. You sparkle, my cupcakes. Take care of yourselves.